Hello, welcome to today's American Flyer Trains. This video is about a recent rebuild of an owner's 740 handcar. The owner's 740 handcar has been returned, so for this discussion I'm going to use my 740A on the left and my 742 plus slides of the owner's 740 rebuild as points of focus. First, the classification of these units. Deeger and Doyle and maybe other American Flyer authors generally group A.C. Gilbert American Flyer locomotive power units into 4 classifications. We're all probably very familiar with these. Steam, diesel, electric. The electric being the EP5s like number 499, and motorized units. Now within motorized units, they further subclassified them. So for purposes of this video, I'm going to refer to Doyle's subclassification of handcars, track maintenance cars, which are not in my collection, and rocket sled, also not in my collection. Handcar numberings were assigned by A.C. Gilbert. A 740 was returned to the owner completely rebuilt, and I'm going to show it in some upcoming still photography. I've rebuilt many 740s and had good results with them. 740A on the left, we'll discuss its differences with the 740 and the 742 on the right. There were also types that will use Doyle's type subclassification to break down the handcar numbers. Deeger also had a subclassification, but they're not going to be referred to here just for simplification. And I'm sure if you've read his books, you've noted that already. The owner's handcar was a 740, and it's very similar to this 740A. His 740 was a Type 3, made from 1952 to 54. Now generally what set the 2s and the 3s apart from the original handcars were things like the vent holes, which are up here on top of the housing, near the pump bar, the multicolored decals, which had, as some authors refer to them as the shield with stripes or wings, the translucent lanterns that sit actually glued to the body, and we're going to talk about what's glued and what's not glued to the body, but there's one beside each operator. There's one on the other side of that operator. Now what identifies the 740A is its drawbar on the bottom on the chassis. Mine is a 740A Type 4. And again, the drawbar is the most distinguishing characteristic. Also the most distinguishing characteristic is the fact that the drawbar has to fit in a notch right here where it's inserted and held in place by the screw that attaches the chassis and one end to the body. The purpose of the drawbar was to pull, as you probably already know, the 5300T miner's work train from 1953 to 1954 that pulled those 3 tipple cars. One was red, one was green, one was blue. Now, A.C. Gilbert regularly repurposed components and parts for later use, and that goes throughout the history of his trains, and I'm going to actually feature that in some other videos. The notched chassis we're also going to see in my 742 back here. But again, he was simply moving his inventory forward, repurposing it, and not throwing away these notched. Now, could you use a 742 to pull the miner's train? Yes, you could. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to I'm going to order a second drawbar, insert it here, attach it here, because this particular handcar is very smooth. It produces very little grinding noise in its gears. And of course, when I use it for the purposes of pulling the miner's work train, I won't be able to use the reversing mechanism unless I do it by hand, but I don't think it'd be a good idea to push those tipple cars. It'd be better to pull them. So I will make sure that the reversing rod is placed in this position. This is pressed in, which would indicate it's going to travel in that direction. And I'll be able to pull the miner's train. Now, the grinding of the gears in these cars is just part of their nomenclature. It's just something that occurs, and you can't, I've tried to get that noise out. Maybe you've got some solutions to do that. This one produces a fairly large grinding noise. This one is very quiet and very smooth. I don't know why they differ that much. Their internal structure looks, to me, that looks identical, but for some reason, this one just grinds away. It runs great. It just grinds, makes that grinding noise. This one does not. So I'd rather have this one running for my guest than the noisy one. Let's look at 742. 742 is the Handcar with the reversing mechanism and gears and hardware and rod. It was made between 1955 and 56, and this one is a Type 2, which basically is set aside because the shield no longer has the stripes or the wings that you saw on the 740 or 740A. It does have, of course, the ventilation, which stayed in these cars since Type 2 of 740. And let's see what else. Oh, on the die-cast. Well, before I go to the die-cast, it has the lanterns as well. Keep in mind, these are glued, and I'm going to mention that because the men are not glued down. And, of course, this one, this 742, has the drawbar notch, which means this chassis, this die-cast chassis, was probably advanced forward from leftover inventory and parts and repurposed from 740 and 740As up to the 742. I'm going to go ahead and install a drawbar on this one, as I mentioned earlier, because it runs in such a quiet mode, a little bit more responsive. Of course, I won't use the reversing part of it at the time I'm pulling the cars, but otherwise I might one day put it back on here. Let's see, what else? The reversing rod, which is here, when it hits an object like this, it'll send it in the opposite direction going that way and vice versa. They work fine. I had this one installed with a reversing section of track, a 10-foot section, straight track on my previous layout. They work fine, but you've got to fine-tune them. If it hits a solid object to push that rod in too hard, it's going to make the car jump up and maybe even jump off the track. So you can't just go slamming into the object. At least that was my experience. Also, you run the risk of breaking off these pins that are right here, which kind of makes that striking of an object to be more even instead of turning the car just a little bit. Now, I have used the green bumpers for that purpose, but those green bumpers will come off easily once one of these cars slams into it. So what I did was I I braced the green bumper down with the packaging straps, the zip straps, and that seemed to work just fine, although it still takes a little bit of fine-tuning to get it to work.